Yeah, good morning or good evening, wherever you are.
Wherever you are. So Kelsey, we just kicked it off asking people to use the chat box to let us know what their why is for being here and what they want to get out of this webinar. David Delamarter actually just chatted us. He said, as a company that's constantly building our culture, I wanted to know what are the warning signs that we're becoming a toxic culture or slowly becoming a toxic culture. That's a good one.
Good question.
Yeah, we'll definitely go over that a little bit too. And Jeff Johansson says, I strive for my clients to have a happy, engaged, and safe. To be happy, engaged, and safe, and I want my employees to learn what I can that prevents that. And can you guys see the chat too?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. And then James, Kelsey, do you want to go in and read that?
Yeah, so James said, what things I need to watch to lower the opportunity of my workplace becoming toxic? Yeah, it's good to be proactive. You know, I think a lot of people wait until it's more of a reactive, and that's often when we come in. But I love working with clients or with people who are really being thoughtful and intentional ahead of time. Ooh, Brett. Hey, Brett. I'm interested in learning more about the slippery, sneaky version of toxicity. Ooh, yeah, the kind of subtle one. I run into teams all the time who might be completely blind to behaviors that are toxic because leaders think they are delivering the best. Good intentions, but off the mark. Yeah, we talk a lot about the difference between intent and impact. And the truth is we're all learning and growing, but at the same time, there is some slippery, sneaky toxicity. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and it's also, there's toxicity that you don't really know is toxic. You know, maybe it's just a learned behavior.
I think that's a really good point. That, you know, over all the years that I've worked, I really have yet to see somebody who comes into work with the intention of making someone else's day miserable. You know, they just happen to have had a bad day, or that's, as you're pointing out, that that's just normal for them. So we're going to get into some of that kind of what can be a slippery slope, or how we allow behaviors that, and maybe even 10 years ago or 15, 20 years ago, they were accepted as norms, and somebody hasn't changed, but doesn't apply today as well. Cultures change.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. For everyone else coming through, go ahead and locate the chat button and let us know, you know, what you want to get out of this webinar or what your why is for being here. If you don't know those two, just let us know where you're coming from. Maybe you're in California, like Kelsey. I think you're in California right now.
Yeah.
Or Canada, like Ron. Anywhere in the world, just let us know.
I like how in the States, like California gets a specific shout out, but Canada's just like,
you're a whole continent.
Yes, I'm used to that. That's sort of a norm. It's where the cold weather comes from. That's it.
The north, right.
Yeah, I had a boyfriend who's from Australia, and people would say, how's the weather in Australia? And it's like, well, it's a really big continent, so there's many weather. Awesome. Noelle says, I'm just wanting to review what signs to be aware of. Okay, super. Awesome. I have to say, every time I see this picture of myself, I used it for that face app that makes you like older. And every time I see this picture, I just think of that. So I can't even look at it anymore. Looks like Gail says she's from Minneapolis, certified trainer partner with the fund department. Awesome. We just spent time with Nick from the fund department, Ron and I both last week. And she loves learning how she can impact humans for the better in the workforce. You're in the right place.
Yeah, I love Minneapolis too. That's really good weather right now. Love it. All right, let's see. We got a couple people in here, so we can go ahead and actually get started a little bit early so that we can make some extra time for your questions about maybe your specific culture, how to deal with toxicity, things like that. So let's go and get started so we can make sure we have time to hit those questions. Okay, so quick intro from me. I'm Bree. I'm your host. I am a part of the DH team. I help host these webinars, and I'm also a part of the marketing team where I manage the blog and other content that comes out to speak to people like you wondering about how to better their cultures for a more profitable and sustainable business. So Kelsey, why don't you go introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Kelsey Lotus Wong. I have been with Delivering Happiness for almost 6 years now, which feels like a lifetime, but it's been a real joyful ride, kind of being on this happiness bus together. And I've gotten to sit in a lot of different seats, from marketing to community to biz dev, but I've been coaching for the last several years, and gotten to work both in the US and abroad. We have projects right now that I'm on in Vietnam and Japan, and we have stuff in Egypt and Kazakhstan and so many different places. So it's really a joy to be a part of this team. And I also run internal culture at Delivering Happiness. So, it's very practice what you preach, walk the talk. And we are going through our own culture refresh as well. So it's, this topic is alive and well, and not in like, there's always like every organization has its challenges, is I guess what I'm saying. But just happy to be here, and thanks everyone for joining us.
And I'm Ron Mandel. I've been working in the people development space for a lot of years, and with DH in the last 8 years. And my why for both this call and in general for being alive and contributing, I've in being involved in, say, the HR side and learning and development side initially, we'd run programs that were helpful to people, but they would go back into their organizations and get squashed there. I mean, there's always exceptions. People can take a bad situation, still work within it. But working in culture, looking at the whole overall systems, because systems will beat people 9 times out of 10. And building the right kind of organizational systems, right kind of values and culture really can empower people to be the best they can be. And clearly in today's competitive world, people need to get the best out of people, create the right environment for that. And I've had the good fortune to work around the world in all sorts of sectors: pharma, heavy manufacturing, healthcare, finance. And it doesn't matter whether it's China or India, United States, Canada, Ireland, all places I've worked where people are people, and put them in the right environment and they flourish, and in the wrong environment, it's very difficult for them to be the best they can be, and also for the organization to be the best it can be. So we'll get into some of the whys and hows in our call, and looking forward to that.
Awesome. Thank you both. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to gain today. So we're going to learn why cultures become toxic, explore tips and insights on what to do about it in your organization, and dive deeper with your questions during our Q&A session. Your best tools for this webinar will be that chat button we experimented with those questions in the beginning. There's also a Q&A feature, but be sure that we'll be monitoring the chat, trying to get to your questions as well. If we don't get to your questions too, just message us with your email so that we can follow up on those questions. And then we'll talk about the culture audit workshop, or the people systems audit workshop, a little bit. And we'll also follow up via email with a worksheet that's really handy. We've had a couple clients fill this out when they start thinking about their culture, to really just frame like where their culture is at, how it's affecting their business, and what kind of pain points they want to focus on for the next year. So we will go into that and kick it off with our DH formula.
Yes, so this is a very simple formula that we use with our clients, and we do have kind of more behind our method. But when we talk about creating a happy, sustainable, thriving business and work environment, we're talking, we're trying to shift the conversation from focusing solely on customers to actually focusing on employees. So you'll see this first piece as happier employees equals happier customers equals more profitable businesses and meaningful lives. That's kind of the foundation of the work that we do. We really believe that culture transformation and thriving work environment starts from the inside out. And so we're really trying to shift organizations and leaders' consciousness and awareness to just go a little bit deeper and focus on the individual and their experience at work, because that affects everything down the line. So this is the kind of method we're thinking about. It's really about designing our cultures by design versus cultures by default. So we'll get into that more. Anything you want to add, Ron, on this simple formula? It's pretty straightforward.
Well, I think it is as simple as it is. There's something profound in it, as you've been saying, Kelsey. That it seems that if we focus on the customer, we're going to get where we want to get to, wowing customers, delighting customers. You see all those books and comments on that. But the idea that if you have an unhappy employee, guess what? They're going to take that out in some way, shape, or form on the customer, versus having a happy employee. That'll ripple out in some positive way to a customer. Seems pretty obvious, but I think as we'll get into our explanation, there's a profound difference in how you operate in an organization if you're looking at it from the outside in versus inside out.
That's very true. And I would say that even the book Delivering Happiness, it's not that a lot of everything was rocket science necessarily, but it was just this permission giving for people to do the right thing. And I think that's kind of the magic of this. So next slide, Bree. And this quote really kind of just underscores the point. And the late great Maya Angelou said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And we really believe that at Delivering Happiness, and we really love working with people who get that innately, but they're trying to figure out how to apply that and how to kind of center their organization around connection and around meaning and around passion and around purpose, but also, of course, getting the work done that needs to be done. And at many of the organizations we work with, we focus on personal emotional connections, PECs, to ensure that both people internally feel connected, like employees feel really connected and appreciated and valued. And then that transcends to how they appreciate and wow their customers, and make sure that those customers feel really valued, appreciated. Anything to add, Ron, on this piece?
The heart, we're saying the heart of the matter, or the heart of an organization is people. And I think that's not new information, but is that the focus of organizations, or is it SOPs and bottom lines? And of course, we need to be able to measure things. So I'm not saying we should not have measures that are, financial measures, but we also need to be very careful about how we measure and support people. So that's what Maya Angelou is speaking to. So that's a good lead into this quote. If you think about it, in 2019, and go on the streets and see a construction, road construction site, and you'll see a foreman still standing there, and it's going to be a foreman standing there watching over people doing the construction. And the mindset behind that is, if that supervisor isn't overseeing them, they're going to, when the boss isn't looking, they're going to not work. And of course, when you treat people like children, it almost is self-fulfilling. They'll act like children, and maybe when the boss turns his head, they won't be working. In today's world, you can't have a boss watching every single employee. That model of job descriptions and trying to get somebody to, management by objectives and hold people accountable for those kinds of things. In a world that's increasingly more complex, and where the speed to be able to respond to the changes in the economy need to be done very quickly, you can't use that model to be able to drive success. So Just give one example of an organization that we were working with, where it ties in with the point you were making before, Kelsey, about happier employees. This is a hospital that wanted to be able to improve patient satisfaction. Very worthy goal. Came up with a program called Compassionate Connections. Very right on topic for 2019. But when the focus was, let's be compassionate in our connections with patients. That was 98% of what the program focused on. It didn't have an impact on the patients, and they were miffed. It didn't seem to make sense. They had invested $700,000, put 700 people, I think, through the program, and it didn't change patient satisfaction scores. Clearly, the issue is that they weren't being compassionate to one another. When the boss isn't looking, are people being compassionate? If they're not being compassionate to one another, guess what? It's not going to end up impacting the patients the way they hoped it would. And so when we were brought in, it was really to help them refocus on, take the same program, take the same focus, but the same content, but focus it on each other. How do nurses treat each other? How do physicians treat nurses? How do nurses treat technicians? All of those moments of truth, if they're done in a compassionate way, the patient will feel that. And if they're not done in a compassionate way, if two people in a hallway are not berating each other or not being friendly to one another, patient hears that and wonders how they're going to be treated if their people at work around them aren't being treated well. So,
Right.
So go ahead and add something, Kelsey. Oh, you're on
Kelsey,
mute.
you're muted.
Right. I would just add that along with what Jen's quote here says, there's a great Airbnb post about called "Don't F Up the Culture" is the name of it. But what he's talking about, what Brian, the CEO, is talking about, is how culture is a sum of every interaction, every email, every moment, every conversation. And I think often organizational systems get in the way of this natural occurring connection. So a lot of times we facilitate, the goal is to just remove the barriers to connection. And it's funny how a lot of things resolve themselves once there's just that shared understanding of shared values, shared purpose, shared why, and all the work stuff starts to dissolve. So I'm sure Bree wants us to go to the next slide. So let's move along.
Yeah, let's go ahead. Talking about making sure everyone's aligned on the same thing, I want to go into the topic of hire and fire.
Definitely.
Just a little quickly so that we can move into the why behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, one of the big shifts in our world today is that if you want to have people operating well together, you've got to hire them for more than just the technical skills that are required in a job. Is there a fit culturally, values-wise, and knowing that from the get-go, and even asking people when they're applying for a job, to be testing for values, and looking for the ways in which they have done things in their previous jobs or in their school careers that shows that they live values and made decisions based on values. Simple things that you can ask for them to fill in on an application is talk about a tough decision they made and how did they work that through. You'll hear whether they use values to make that decision, or they flip a coin, or do what seemed to be expedient. So really looking to hire and then interview in that interview process to see whether they're team-oriented, individual, competitive, collaborative, setting up games for people to simulation so that you can see how they actually operate, not what they say on a form. Because if you ask somebody, are you a team player? Of course, they're going to say yes. And the other side of that is, hire slowly but fire quickly, and fire based on values, because you want to give people feedback so that they understand where the gaps might be. You want to coach them to be able to close those gaps. But if it's not working, the toxicity of somebody who maybe on the task performing well, but on the values not, they're influencing a lot of other people. So make sure that it's clear to the organization what's tolerated and what's not tolerated.
Right. Kelsey, do you want anything to add on this slide?
Yeah, I would just say that to go along with what Ron is saying, that when you have your values very clearly defined, so the value statement, and then the behaviors, which we'll probably talk a little bit about more later, but that's when you can actually have that conversation and that coaching conversation. When you just say something like, oh, it's not a culture fit, like, what does that even mean? If you haven't defined your culture, then it's not really a fair reason. And so I think when people know ahead of time what your expectations are on a behavioral, like how we show up here, this is what it means to be authentic, if that's your value, or this is what it means to be respectful. What does it actually mean at this organization? When that's really clear, then you can have those coaching conversations or those performance conversations. Or those exit conversations, because it's very clear as to what those expectations were that were not met. So yeah, that's all.
Right. Just like obviously we look at the slide, we're seeing Great Place to Work, and we're seeing these companies, their logos under here. They definitely are where they are, considered great places to work because part of their culture, and that's one of the biggest attraction points for people to want to work there and to stay there. And we'll get into that
Definitely
too.
And to your point, that's even, Bree, that with millennials, that's even much more a factor. People looking for the right fit for them and looking for companies that are great places to work. By definition, it's great places to work, treat people really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot of sometimes there's this belief that only millennials want to have purpose at work, but actually there's studies have shown that no, it's every generation wants that. It's just that this generation is kind of prioritizing and kind of demanding it. It's like a non-negotiable. But yeah, so this slide is kind of our who slide. Who matters, and at the center there's this inner circle of me, and that's that happy employees. So really speaking to the individual, why they matter, and then extending out to the we, which is your team or your organization, and then community. It's kind of a basket word that could mean people that you serve. So your clients, customers, vendors, partners, maybe it's your local community, or you consider your country, your community, or the world at large. But we really try to use this again, simple model, but starting from the inside out. And I think a lot of companies really do well at the we to community level. So they really treat the customer really well, but they lack a focus on the individual from the inside. Yeah, so that's where we're just trying to shift the priority and really kind of ripple from the inside out. Ron, why don't you speak to this one? What happened?
Well, yeah, if we look at why things have gotten to where they are, this self-serving me, I think, is an interesting dilemma. And at some level, I'm going to blame the school system at one level. If you think about what you get measured on in school, it's all about me. There's no we there in school. It's my marks, what I did, my studying. Even team projects cause grief for students, because somebody who doesn't participate fully still can get the mark that the group gets. So we built a society and a system that says, stab somebody in the back, don't return a book that has really important data. It's back to the library until after the exam. And we've let people get away with that. And I think that's what's caused a lot of our grief in our organizations. Dedicating to self at the expense of others. And I'll give you a very specific example of that, of a client that we were working with, where the individual treated their customers really well. They're a account manager, and very sweet, very caring, very dedicated. But when they came back into the internal organization, they were just a bull in a china shop, very demanding, just tearing a strip off somebody if there was a mistake made or they wasn't done in a timely way. And they spoke to her about this, but were they willing to really hold her accountable for her behavior internally? Because she was bringing in sales. And that's where toxicity, how do cultures become toxic? When somebody is dedicated to self at the expense of others and is able to get away with that, then you just throw your hands up and say, this is a joke. I've been in other organizations where the person who's marched across the stage for the Employee of the Month awards, but they don't live values, and people are throwing up when they see this. How could this person have been selected? Now their criteria was, did they perform well? Did they get the code written in time? Did they bring in the sales? But how they did that is now so important to measure. And the science of happiness, and the tools that are available today allow that more so than ever. So that's where the seed of toxicity is allowing behavior to be propagated and not holding people accountable. As I say, I think the schools do that. Sometimes parents do that. Very self-indulgent to their children and not holding people accountable. You get awards for showing up at at a sporting event, playing on a team. So we need to deal with that issue, and I think that culture is a way that brings that to the fore.
Yes. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, and then what we're saying is, the me-we community model can be perceived in a wrong way of being this self-serving me. But what Ron's kind of alluding to, there's also a name for this that's become kind of funny, but it's called the brilliant jerk, which is on the next slide. And there's this thing that happens where we start to, because somebody's so brilliant at their job, because they're such a high performer, we keep them around. And this is just an article about why Netflix doesn't tolerate that anymore, but they don't tolerate it because it really starts to erode the culture. Even if initially they're, a high performer, it really, I'm sure people can relate here. And sometimes that person is completely unaware, and so they're doing it completely unintentionally, and that is an opportunity for a coaching conversation, or even for someone to have the guts to just be really honest and real in a kind and gracious way as possible. But it's really not worth it ultimately. So go ahead.
Yeah, Daniel Goleman, if you're familiar with his work with emotional intelligence, brought some insight into this world, because IQ, which there's a correlation between brilliance and being able to do even brilliant work with IQ, this individual task, getting an assessment done, an analysis done, versus EQ, which is an ability to work with and through others, inspiring other people. The good news is that EQ, as you probably know, that's learnable. I mentioned before about school. If you have high IQ, you're probably going to get good marks. You're probably going to win some scholarships. And your EQ skills may never have been developed, and nobody rewarded them. In kindergarten, you may have got a mark for did you get along well with the other kids, but that's not measured in high school or university. So, we know today that it's something that's important for people to develop in their EQ. They're being compassionate, empathetic. Those are leadership skills. In Daniel Goleman's work, what was fascinating is that he worked from the premise that let's follow people who got straight A's at university. Did they end up being more senior positions in the business world? And the answer is no, because they weren't able to inspire other people. The EQ was the measure of success for people to move into higher places in organizations, because you need to be able to get other people to come along with you rather than just tell them what to do because you're smarter than them.
True that. Thanks, Ron. We just have a couple more slides and then it'll be time for Q&A. So this is just another example of what happens in toxic cultures. So you could have a very strong mission, but not a strong culture. So I just put this example, working here is like the wild, wild west. That's something that a client, or not a client, but actually a friend's company, she described their culture as working like the wild, wild west, because they had a very, very strong mission, a very powerful, I'm not gonna say what the organization is, but it's one that we probably all know and love. And they have a strong mission, but working there is very competitive. They're fighting over funding, and she said it's like the wild, wild west. And she left this very, prestigious organization that anyone would say is a dream to work there because of the culture. And I think that's what happens a lot, is people don't leave, what do they say? You don't quit your job, you quit your manager. But I would say that it's shifted to even, you quit the culture. And there's a lot of reports, from LinkedIn about job quitters and why people leave. And a lot of times it has to do with the culture, the work environment, a desire for more flexibility, a desire for more freedom. And that's a lot of what our models speak to, because they're all based on the science of happiness, positive psychology, and so scientific sense, but also just human sense. Like, of course, you want to be in a place where you're, valued, appreciated, and that's designed for you to flourish. Of course, no place is perfect. The Buddha says there's no perfect place to meditate, but at the same time, we can design for healthier work environments.
And an example of both strong mission versus strong culture is that you all know in your cities, wherever you live, that there's good hospitals and bad hospitals, or better hospitals and worse hospitals. And it's not because the doctors or nurses went to a better school in one hospital versus another. It's not because one has better equipment than another. It's a culture. They both have a strong mission. There isn't one that would say they're all about, delivering outstanding healthcare to patients. That's their mission. But do they have a strong culture that supports that? And that's the difference between a great hospital and a good hospital, or a mediocre or poor hospital, is the culture.
Yeah. So what can you do about it? There's a lot of things, but we're just going to talk about two right now so that we can get into your specific questions. The first one that we, really stand by is values and behaviors. It sounds almost too simple in some ways to be true, but we actually just work with an organization. We spent 9 months helping them create their values. And that means it's not really about the values. I mean, it is about the values themselves, but it's more about the journey of transformation, and helping them get really clear on who they are, what they stand for, and also this kind of combination of aspirational, but also like actual. I mean, the values, there's some values, whether they're defined or not. At an organization, there's a culture, whether it's defined or not, but getting really clear on what are the core principles here. You don't have to call them values, core principles, but that's really key. And then the behavior piece, I think, is super, super duper important, because when you can, and a behavior is really strong when it's specific, measurable, and you can really see it. If your behavior is be empathetic, that is hard to tell, even though, you could probably feel whether someone is or isn't. But if you can find ways to clarify that, maybe it's like, or if it's authenticity is the value, maybe the behavior is don't say anything about somebody that you wouldn't say behind their back, that you wouldn't say to their face. That's really, you can see if that happens. If someone does that behind someone's back versus to someone's face, you can see that. Anything to add about B2B, Ron? And then I know you want to talk about performance management.
Well, just to build on what you're saying, Kelsey, because it's an important critical piece, and I touched on it at the very beginning when I said I don't believe people come into work trying to behave in ways that are unproductive and cause grief for people, but what they do, and we all do, and those tend to be blind spots for us. And the way we turn something that's blind into something that we can actually see is through behaviors, because we'll do 360 feedback on that. So I may think that if you ask respect, how respectful do I believe I am? I've had that, asked that question hundreds of times. I've never heard anybody say 4, that they don't think themselves as being respectful. They're always saying 7 is the lowest, and 8 and 9s. But if you turn to behavior, as Kelsey, you were pointing out, what's a behavior of respect? The example you just gave, that you say to someone's face, what you don't say anything behind their back, you'd say it to their face. That's something you can go and ask their colleagues, their boss, their directs. Is Ron saying things directly to that person, or is is something being said behind your back, or and other behaviors for teamwork? Does the person, does Ron come to meetings and prepared and volunteer to take work, to take on work after a meeting? Those are behaviors that you can then measure by the people on the team as to whether or not I am being a team player, rather than do I think I'm being a team player? Because everyone has a self-image that tends to be, more often, sadly than not, that we don't want to live with thinking we're jerks, so we hold ourselves to, of course, we're behaving well.
Ron, I just want to take a moment. We talked a little bit about 360 feedback. I just want to make sure everybody knows what that is. Can you go ahead and just explain the concept of that, and why it's a big tool we use to measure behaviors?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, because it is critical that in order to close the gap between an individual's view of themselves and being able to be coached to be able to close a gap between something that they're not doing well. What we do is, it's easy to measure what someone does, because did you write enough code, did you answer the phone within whatever amount of time, the different measures that you can have on what people do. Did you perform certain number of operations, whether that's in a hospital or lab tests, etc. But then the how you did those, and having a specific connection between a value, a task, a performance, job, and then how you performed it, which is the value. That's written up, and that's tying in a little bit to performance management. Those are discussed at the beginning of the year, and then a survey is sent out to that person's colleagues to say, well, how are you noticing Ron's behavior? How are you noticing Kelsey's behavior? And you giving them the specific question, which they knew beforehand. And to Kelsey's point earlier, when we spent 9 months creating the values and behaviors, now when people are having these behaviors used in a 360 feedback to measure other people, and of course other people measuring them, they were part of creating those, the behaviors that make sense to them. They had input on those behaviors, and that's what ties into actually coaching conversations and performance management.
Awesome. And are there any other key things to think about when it comes to performance management before we just get into the questions? I think there are a couple questions that kind of linked back to it as well.
Well, the most important piece I'd say about performance management, and having been involved for a lot of years around that, is that it's very normal for someone to measure what somebody does, because that's an expectation of any leader who's going to his or her employees. You're going to talk about, well, what are you working on this week, and where's the status of this particular project? What's missed in too many organizations are the values connection to that task. So I can be a great salesperson, but am I helping my fellow salespeople? That should be a part of the measure of being a good salesperson. Is, do I share the methods that I use, or the things that work best for me? Do I pass those tips on to my colleagues? If no one measures me on that, yeah, someone will do it out of their good heart. But if you want consistently good performance in a sales team, as an example, you want to hold people accountable in performance management, not just on their sales, but are they helping their colleagues be successful in sales? And that's a value of teamwork or collaboration.
Right.
So,
And that contributes to the broader culture. You know, it doesn't just contribute to like their own performance, but when you're helping others, that's a part of the culture that you want to foster at your company, which probably falls along the lines of the value of, you know, creating community or teamwork. So it's all kind of integrated.
and it integrates into, it's absolutely right what you're saying, Brie, that it ties into a better culture, and guess what? Into better performance, because if, you know, a salesperson helps another salesperson, that salesperson does better, and our bottom line gets better. And in a negative place where the toxic culture is involved, where I only care about my own sales results, I don't give a damn about anybody else, I don't help anybody else. In fact, in the worst cases, I'm glad when someone else looks bad because it makes me look better. So that, you know, creates this vicious cycle versus a virtuous cycle.
Right. Let's drop into the Q&A section, because there are a couple of questions related to performance management I want to get to. One of them I want to kick off this Q&A, and if you do have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat box. If we don't get to it, you can also put in your question in the chat box and with your email, and someone from our team, April, will go ahead and correspond with you afterwards. And also, of course, you're going to get a recording of this webinar afterwards too. One of the questions I want to dive into is about measuring. So, you know, we talk about individual evaluations for performance management, but in the broad organization, what are some KPIs that might indicate, I guess, good cultural health, as Brett called it in the chat? Some other common KPIs that our clients use to indicate, you know, hey, we're doing well and the culture is directly contributing to this. I know they all can encompass culture, but what are some key ones that you try to start out with?
I mean, certainly the area of employee engagement, if you're looking at that space of, you know, I mean, of course, that ties into culture if employees are engaged. So one of the themes in a healthy organization is, give one example from science of happiness, sense of progress. So do people feel that they are growing and learning? Do they have opportunities to be able to see themselves in 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road? You know, is there something beyond today that the company is talking to them about and supporting them to be able to grow? And growth is an important part for people because, you know, sadly, you know, when someone's doing an exit interview, they find out that the reason that they're leaving isn't the money, is that nobody ever talked to them about their career and you know, the opportunities that could have been there for them if somebody had spoken to them about that. So that's another way of, you want to engage people, you need to have some conversations with them that talks about where's their future and how can we help them get there. And sometimes it's surprising, you know, that people would want to learn something or be able to develop a skill set that may be different than what it seems like a typical career path would be. Healthy organizations will know that and support people to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I would just add, we have, well, there's two things. I mean, at DH internally, we use the DHI index or the DH index. It's a tool that measures you could say the cultural health on an individual level, but then it combines all the results on an organizational level. And to Ron's point, part of that is sense of progress, something that we measure, sense of connectedness, a higher purpose, and also a sense of control, which is around freedom and autonomy. So I'll let you check that out. There's a lot of elements in there, but then also we do use KPIs as well, the key performance indicators, and every organization is going to do it a little bit different, right? Because KPIs are dependent on that department or that, you know, whatever their role is. But it is really important to have, you know, and that's kind of this marriage or this like this joining between culture and business. And initially, for organizations, sometimes culture feels like this extra thing that we do, and it's like about events and having fun. But culture is actually fully embedded in the business. And when you get to that point, your KPIs directly relate to your engagement scores or your happiness at work indicators. And so we measure both at DH. We have quarterly check-ins with our leads for our, we call them pods, but they're basically kind of departments. So we have quarterly check-ins, and we also do one-on-ones with between leads and their pod members. But then we also look at the overall health of the organization. So I highly recommend checking out DHI. There's lots of other tools too. I know CultureAmp has a great tool.
And I also wanted to I think Brett in the chat is trying to hint at the conflict between subjective evaluation and objective. I think Kelsey, you're really bringing it home where the both are required to really evaluate your culture. There's no way that we can go to a client and say, okay, based on just numbers alone, we know exactly what you need to work on with your culture. There's a lot of qualitative research that goes into it. And there are a lot of multinational companies who are, gathering so much data around their employees, but then they don't know what to do with it because they're not taking that qualitative aspect into consideration. So it is both too.
Well, and we try to use some numbers where we can as well. So back to the behaviors, supporting a colleague, helping them on their projects, you can rate that person on a 1 to 10 scale, and you might rate yourself as, I think I'm doing a great job. I'm going to rate myself at a 9 in terms of the support I give to my team members, and they're giving me a 4, or support I'm giving to my boss, and I may rate myself at a 8, and my boss may say it gives me a 10, because I'm doing a good job of brown nosing. And support to my directs, I may rate myself at a 7 and they're giving me a low score. So you try to get some numbers around that. And one other point, I think, in terms of KPIs, something that you can have in a conversation and put real numbers around that, and saying, just the same example I was giving about support to my team, my colleagues on my team. You can tell somebody that's an area that you need to work on. You've been doing a great job in terms of the work you do individually, but when it comes to supporting other team members, that's something that a leader can be saying that to his or direct report, and say to them, right now, based on the scores that we've had, you're at a 4 out of 10, based on some data that we've collected by scores, questionnaires. If you stay at a 4, whether it's your bonus or your overall rating is going to be at best satisfactory, because you're outstanding in terms of your task, but you're poor in terms of the this support your colleagues, then that rating can't be outstanding. You can't just recognize and get that message across to people. You can't have an outstanding rating when a value that we've connected to this task is under, you're not meeting standards here. You can also tie it to bonuses, that when you get to a 7, you'll get 80% of your bonus. If it stays at a 4, you're getting 0 bonus. So you can and help people really understand not only where they are, how to get to where they want to get to, so that as a leader, it's saying, look, I'll sit in on some of your meetings also, to give you feedback on how you could be more supportive, or I can sit in and bring a colleague in, and the 3 of us can sit here and give you specific examples of what you could be doing that would be seen as more supportive. So the leader's job is to help somebody close that gap, not just say good luck, because the person probably doesn't necessarily know what to do, but you need to be there to support them.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. And I just want to finish one thing with what Ron's saying around this kind of performance culture and performance management. And you kind of said it a little bit, but it's just you can create these weighted scores. So maybe 50% of your bonus or 50% of your performance is based on culture and 50% is on performance. A lot of organizations, that's pretty hard to get there. But even if 20% were based on. So, and maybe you measure culture by the 360 feedback, and then the other part is on their regular KPIs. Just moving towards that is a good thing. Go ahead, Bree.
Oh, I just see a comment here. I see a comment from Brett. It's not taking the subjective issues to cash, because that, because then if it's subjective, you're really somebody's going to say, well, that's not fair, because I think I have exceeded it, and you're telling me I didn't. You're trying to make it as best you can objective, so that and I gave that example before, where you're asking peers to rate Brett on whatever the behavior is, if it's from a teamwork or a collaboration behavior, which you and your team members were part of creating that behavior, and then using some form of 360 feedback to get an objective number. It's never perfect in terms of, but it's hard to argue. Like if I think I'm a 10, but I'm seeing data that says my colleagues have rated me a 3, that is something that's a little bit more real to have that conversation.
Awesome. I want to shift gears a bit to talk about culture change. There are a couple of questions I've been seeing floating around about how to implement some best practices when it comes to change. And there were a couple of comments we got in during registration I wanted to address about dealing with previous employees or managers. So just to frame it, when you want to work on your culture, you have employees that have been there maybe from the beginning or have been there through past culture initiatives. How can you, implement change or improve your culture and get buy-in from these team members? What are some best practices or some advice, best tips that we can give?
I mean, and it's a great question. When you're changing the culture, someone was hired for a certain reason. They've been rewarded for certain behaviors in the past, and now you're trying to change that on them. It can be seen as unfair, and in some ways, it is unfair. I think the biggest point I would make, and Kelsey, you touched on that, like the work we were doing for the last 9 months that's still ongoing. It's the journey. If you come in with a new supposed culture, a new set of values, new set of behaviors, and say, this is what we're going to do, and impose it, you're going to get pushback for sure, and legitimate pushback. But to engage people in that journey, to let them have a voice in it, a voice both about the speed of which you're making this implementing this change, what the change is, what does it look like, what's their concerns about it, and they legitimately deserve coaching to be able to get to that place and the support that they need to be able to make the changes. It's not fair to the organization to say, well, just because we did that 10 years ago, that's what we're going to be doing now or in the next 10 years. But on the other hand, we need to, as I said, give them a voice, have them involved in that journey, and then support them in some of the changes that, because at the gut level, I think that people understand that what we're talking about in values is something that's good. There isn't a value that I've heard that somebody would say, no, I don't buy that. I don't believe in teamwork. I don't believe in integrity. I don't believe in honesty. I don't believe in caring. It's just, how do you help people get there? And I think it's a voice and support, and it's a journey. It's not a destination that we get to tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely, Ron. Nice response. I would just add, and I know Fiona just dropped another webinar of ours about the roadmap. We constructed this roadmap to kind of create an idea of how to kind of go on that journey together. And I think that I would say there's so many different ways to the peak. Like there's so many different paths. But what I would say is that something that is really critical is having leadership buy-in. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be every single leader, but having at least a very, very strong advocate or ally to bring this change about is really key. And in the roadmap, there's kind of more step-by-step how to kind of go into that. But yeah, that's very, very important. And then, like Ron said, engaging people step by step. So we are just, like I said, went through this process of helping another organization refresh their values. And we had to call it values. We couldn't even call it culture transformation because there was so much resistance to that word. So we called it a values refresh. And again, it's taken 9 months, but we engaged a small group. We had a really strong one leader advocate at the top, and they kind of pushed it through people operations or HR. But then they engaged a leadership team, or really a culture team, kind of across the organization. So a big organization, and they were able to then, we helped them to do different activities and ways of engaging every single employee. They have about 1,500 employees, but you could do this whether it's 50 employees, 10 employees, 10,000, but finding ways to involve everybody in that process. And part of it may be qualitative, like or quantitative, using like surveys or some kind of, I always like it when it's more than a survey, when it's more of an in-person engagement survey. It might mean like you do some pre-work with a small team, and then you do some bigger work where you involve more people. You can also help people find their personal values, and those personal values end up shaping the organizational values. So there's many ways to kind of go about creating values, but we really kind of like stand on this piece because it allows you to, it's a very important building block for you to have that culture conversation. And when you have that conversation, it can lead to this greater transformation or org change. And people start to shift. And I've seen people who are incredible naysayers or resistors have a personal opening or a personal shift, and then they start to loosen up. But there are cases where that doesn't happen too. And it's also an indicator for people whether this is the right place for them. So,
and I also want to add that we are following up for everyone who's attending this webinar with our Why Culture Matters worksheet, and that's a pretty great conversation start to have within your teams. And it kind of attracts both the head and the heart of the culture change. You know, there are people that really respond well to the numbers, like, all right, so what's our turnover rate look like? Has it gotten better? What have we tried before? Things like that. But then, you know, other things where you're asking, do people feel burnt out? How do people feel when they come to work? You know, and that kind of frames these conversations, these beginning conversations about, you know, why culture does matter and, you know, how to get team buy-in. So I'll look out for that, because that's been really helpful for a lot of our clients to really get those conversations going, whether it's with your manager, just a team, or, you know, maybe you're on a team that makes these big decisions around the organization too.
And there's one other question here that you know, could be a nice summary as well. That what happens if your boss doesn't, you know, they may not even buy into the whole thing of values, but they're not even having performance, and they're having annual performance conversations with you, probably because the system forces that on them. I think managing up is still a possibility here. If you think about it, and you went to a manager and said, I need, and I really appreciate having some conversations with you monthly on how I'm doing and how I can improve, both what and how I can improve, what is the tasks and how, in terms of what we're calling values. But most leaders wouldn't listen to that question and say, you're wasting my time. Like, I've got better things to do than to talk to you about how you can improve your performance, because they're actually held accountable ultimately for their, you know, for their direct performance. So asking for it, I think, as opposed to, you know, there's a lot of managers that are just so busy and they just don't get around to it. And the fact that they don't do it with their 10 other directs doesn't mean that you have to fall into that. You can ask for it. And because what you're asking is you want to get better, and you want to hear their advice and value their advice on what is it that you're doing well that you can keep doing, and, you know, that stop, start, and continue model. What can you start doing that would help, and what could you stop doing that is interfering with your performance? And ask both on the what, the tasks you're doing, and how you're doing them in terms of, I'm sure your company has values. Bring those up and say, well, we say that collaboration is important. What would you expect me to be doing here? Who should I collaborate with? How would it improve? What would I need to do to improve? So I'd say ask for those things, and you can manage up. And we've done things in organizations where the CEO hadn't bought in. Most of the time it does. If we're talking about a full culture change, it is needs to be supported in the C-suite. But we've had someone second in command being able to influence, or a department that ends up making, changing and looking really good, and it then ripples up into the organization as well.
I just wanted to take a couple seconds here. If you have asked a question and it has not been addressed so far, go ahead and put your email into the chat so we can follow up with you, because once we end this, I won't be able to access the chat right away. I want to make sure I get your emails so we can get some further clarification about the specifics about your culture that we could probably help you answer.
Yeah, Bree, I just, I did see that SP asked a question about best pathway to mastery and implementation. That's a bigger conversation, but we will follow up with you. We have 10 steps to building a values-based organization. And also our roadmap is a really good resource for that. And then just to Marcos, yeah, that's a really good question as well about still having challenges between employees and managers. If you could elaborate on what kinds of, you said around communication. Yeah, communication is the #1 challenge or one of the biggest challenges that I see across all kinds of organizations we work with. And so it always depends, like the classic consulting answer. But I do think fostering, opportunities for, and maybe it could even be workshops or trainings all around communication, whether it's nonviolent communication or compassionate communication. We also have a communication workshop too. But I think one of the biggest things around that kind of help make communication easier is one, connection, and then two, even at DH, we are going through a process of having challenges around communication and accountability, because we are a remote team, we are all over the world, and we're also, having challenges with that as well. And we are addressing that by revisiting what are the behaviors that we want to commit to, what are the challenges that we're seeing, what are the tensions that are there, and we have a kind of, we call it the little blue book, but it's our kind of code of conduct, and we're revisiting that because some people are new and some people have been here a while and have different ways of communicating, and we also have created we have like our all employee behaviors, and that's like something that we're all committed to, or like our we behaviors, and then we're having like pod specific behaviors, and it's a process. It doesn't mean that every single thing is going to be followed like automatically, but bringing that conversation to light and finding ways to work through it together, and just, it starts to create ripples of change bit by bit. So if you send us more info about what kind of specific problems, I'm happy to respond, but that's what I can offer now.
And I'll just end on this note. When you talk about communications, to be my summary point here, because I know we're at the end of our time. When you look at communication, it's a big, big word. And I would say break it into 2 areas at least, which is what, you can communicate on task. Parents can communicate at one level of, what'd you do at school today? Or, or a manager with their employee, tell me what tasks you're working on and what progress you're made on them, what status is. And there's communicating on values. And Kelsey, you started out talking about personal, emotional communication or connections, but it's a communication on a personal, emotional level. Communication on values. Opening that door is what I recommend in any organization. That is the same thing if you're talking about a healthy relationship. There's communication on, where are we going? What are we doing? Who's buying groceries? Or what's the task you're working on at work? And then there's a human communication on our values, what's important to you, what's going on in your home, what are you scared of, what are you hope for. When we have that side, values, human, heartfelt communication, you're already on the road to building a values-based organization in a place that people feel good about coming to work on a Monday morning, as opposed to TGIF, I get out of jail for 2 days on Friday.
A really good point, Ron. I know that we are out of time. I do want to thank you, Kelsey and Ron, for joining me on this webinar. I think it was really helpful, insightful for people who are wondering, what to do about their cultures, so they hopefully avoid toxic behaviors or even becoming toxic. One thing I want to leave you all with is a way to take it to the next level and what you can do. We also offer a people systems audit workshop. So this workshop actually looks into your people systems of, how embedded values are, where's your culture at within these systems, kind of evaluating where those pain points lie within your organization and how to tackle them, what to do, and what those best next steps are. So if you have questions on pricing or logistics or how it will help, you can just go ahead and contact my colleague April, and her email is april@deliveringhappiness.com, and we're happy to also relay any questions from the webinar too. So thank you everybody for joining us. It was so awesome to have you here to open up this conversation.
Yes, and please reach out to us. I know that this is a big topic and we can't cover it in 45 minutes. There's so many specifics to your specific organization, and that's why we exist. We love getting into the the complexity of organizational change and culture transformation. So thank you. Be well. Take care of yourselves, and your organizations are lucky to have you.